Welcome to You Betray Me, where secrets are uncovered and stories take unexpected turns. Subscribe and join the journey. It was a cold night, the kind of night where the wind howls through the trees and the shadows seem to stretch unnaturally long. Evan, a young man in his mid-20s, had just moved into an old house on the outskirts of town, seeking a fresh start after a difficult breakup. The house, while rustic and charming, had a certain air of mystery to it, the kind of house you only see in movies where things felt off slightly wrong. But Evan wasn't the superstitious type. He thought it was just the remoteness of the place that gave it its eerie vibe. The house was large, 2 stories with creaky floorboards and antique furniture. It had been empty for years, and its former owners had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispered rumors and dark speculation. It was the kind of place people avoided, but Evan saw it as an opportunity. It was cheap, and the space suited him. It seemed like the perfect retreat. He spent the first few days unpacking, getting used to the creaky stairs and the peculiar layout. He found a door in the hallway that he had never noticed before. It was a small, wooden door tucked away behind a faded tapestry, almost as if it had been hidden on purpose. Evan thought little of it at first, chalking it up to a forgotten storage closet or perhaps a maintenance room. But something about the door intrigued him. It was different from the others in the house. Older, as if it had been there long before the house itself had been built. The door itself was unremarkable. The wood was dark, chipped with age, and the handle was a brass knob, slightly tarnished. But it was the faint smell of mildew, of something damp, that wafted from the crack in the door, which gave him pause. He shook it off, thinking that maybe it was just an old house thing. Later that evening, as Evan sat on the couch sipping his coffee, he heard a faint noise, almost like a whisper. He couldn't place it at first, but it was a soft sound like the wind or something else entirely. He stood up, walking over to the door. It was as though something was pulling him toward it. Without thinking, he reached for the handle, his fingers brushing the cool brass. His heart raced a little, a sensation he couldn't explain. He pulled the door open slightly, just enough to peek inside. But nothing. It was just a dark space. The room was small and dusty, its air heavy with the scent of something decayed. There was nothing in there. No furniture, no signs of life, only a black void. His eyes scanned the room, but the longer he stared, the more uneasy he became. Something felt off. He quickly closed the door, pushing the thought to the back of his mind. It was just an old storage room, he told himself. Nothing to worry about. But that night, as he tried to sleep, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His mind raced, replaying the image of the dark room. The whisper he had heard earlier echoed in his ears, a faint, unintelligible sound that made his skin crawl. And then as he lay in bed, he heard it again, a faint whisper, like a voice coming from behind the door. This time, it was clearer, a single word. Open. Evan's heart skipped a beat. He sat up, his eyes wide. The room was completely silent, the only sound the beating of his own heart. He listened closely, straining for any further noise, but all he could hear was the wind outside. He tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination, but the feeling of dread gnawed at him. The whisper had been too real, too clear. He tried to shake off the thought and lay back down, pulling the covers tightly around himself. But sleep wouldn't come. He tossed and turned for hours, the whispering word haunting him. Open! When morning came, the sunlight filtered in through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. But Evan didn't feel at ease. The strange events of the night weighed heavily on his mind. He told himself it was just the stress of the move, or maybe the isolation of the house was playing tricks on him. After all, it was a new place, and the mind had a way of creating things when it was alone in silence. But something inside him urged him to go back to the door. It was as though it was calling him. He tried to ignore it, focusing on making breakfast, on doing anything to distract himself. But by midday, he found himself standing in front of the door once again, his hand hovering over the knob. He could feel his pulse racing, his breath shallow. He hadn't heard the whisper again, but the sense of unease was still there. The door loomed in front of him, a silent challenge. Should he open it? What could possibly be behind it? He glanced around the hallway, as if expecting someone to be watching. The house felt eerily quiet. No sound, no movement. Just him, alone, with a deep breath. He turned the knob and pushed the door open. This time, the room was different. The darkness seemed deeper, more oppressive. It wasn't just the shadows. It was as though the very air inside the room was heavier, pressing down on him. He stepped inside cautiously, his footsteps echoing off the walls. The door creaked as it swung shut behind him. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, but there was nothing to see. No furniture, no objects, just a thick, suffocating blackness. Then, suddenly, the door slammed shut with a violent force. Evan spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. He fumbled with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him. He was locked inside. His breath quickened, his mind racing. What was happening? How had the door slammed shut? His hand gripped the handle tighter, pulling with all his strength. But the door refused to open. He backed away, his back hitting the cold wall as his pulse raced. A soft sound, like a whisper, filled the room. Open the door. Evan's blood ran cold. The whisper wasn't just a voice. It was a command. Open the door. He stumbled backward, his legs shaky, heart thudding in his chest. He tried to think, tried to make sense of it all, but everything was spinning. What did it want? Why had the door slammed? Why was it locked? And then the whispers grew louder, more frantic. Open the door. The room seemed to close in on him. The walls pressing in tighter, the air thicker with each passing second. He felt like he couldn't breathe, his chest tightening as if the house itself was suffocating him. But still, the door wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. A chill ran down his spine as a cold, invisible force seemed to surround him. The whispers became a chorus, deafening in its intensity. Open the door! Open the door! The words echoed in his mind, louder, more desperate, as if the very walls were alive with the demand. His thoughts grew hazy, the lines between reality and something darker blurring as the whispers consumed him. Evan reached out, his hand trembling. His mind was racing, but there was only one thing he could focus on now: opening the door. He pulled with all his strength, but the knob refused to turn. The room seemed to pulse with the pressure of something unseen, and Evan's fear began to spiral into madness. He didn't understand what was happening, what had happened to the door, to the house, to him. But there was only one thing that remained. The door would not open. Evan's hands gripped the cold brass knob with desperation, his fingers slick with sweat. He could feel the pulse of his heartbeat in his throat, the rapid thudding reverberating through his chest. The whispers had become a maddening chorus now, echoing in every corner of the room. Open, open, open. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking, the voice rising from every crevice, every shadow, until it drowned out everything else. His eyes darted around the suffocating blackness, but there was nothing to see, nothing but the thick, oppressive darkness that seemed to be closing in on him. He could no longer distinguish where the room ended and where the darkness began. The air had turned icy cold, as though he were standing in the heart of a blizzard. Open! Open the door! The voices grew louder, their tone now a shrill command, as if the very fabric of the house itself was alive, watching him, waiting for him to comply. Panic surged within him, and his breath came out in ragged gasps. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to run, to escape, but there was no escape. The door, the only possible means of getting out, was locked tight. He had tried. He had pulled, pushed, and twisted the knob with every ounce of strength in his body, but it refused to budge. The room felt as if it were alive, alive in a way that terrified him to his very core. The temperature had dropped to an unbearable chill, and his skin crawled with the sensation of something unseen brushing past him, almost too close to touch. And then, just as suddenly as the storm of whispers had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. It hung in the air like a thick fog, pressing down on him, suffocating him. Evan stood frozen, not daring to move. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated with fear, and he felt as though the darkness itself was watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. For a long moment, there was nothing but that eerie silence. His breathing was loud in his ears, and he could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his chest. He swallowed, the dryness in his throat making the simple act feel impossible. And then, out of the silence, a new sound broke through, a faint scraping noise. It came from behind him. His body froze, every nerve in his body screaming for him to turn around, to see what was making that sound. But he couldn't. His feet felt rooted to the ground, his body refusing to obey him. The scraping grew louder, closer, as if something, or someone, was moving through the darkness, inching toward him. A low groan rumbled from somewhere deep within the room, a sound so unsettling, so unnatural, that it made his stomach churn. He tried to steady his breath, but it came in shallow bursts, his chest tightening as though he were suffocating. Evan's heart pounded so hard now, he thought it might burst from his chest. He couldn't take it anymore. His legs, shaking with fear, finally obeyed. He turned around, but there was nothing except the oppressive darkness and the cold, suffocating air. Then, suddenly, a cold hand grasped his shoulder. The touch was light, almost delicate, but it sent an icy jolt through his entire body. Evan whipped around, his eyes wide with terror, but again, there was nothing. The room was empty, just the darkness, just the cold. His breathing quickened again, and he stumbled backward, slamming into the wall behind him. He felt his legs give way beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor, his back pressed against the rough wood of the wall. His head spun, and the only thing he could focus on was the gnawing, gut-wrenching fear coursing through his veins. The whispers started again, but this time they were different. They weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from within his own mind. "Open the door." The words echoed in his thoughts, a maddening rhythm that drowned out all other sound. The more he tried to block them out, the louder they became. They were like insects crawling beneath his skin, burrowing deep into his brain. He clasped his hands over his ears, but it did nothing. The voice, the command, persisted. "Open the door." And then the floor beneath him seemed to shift. His body lurched forward, and he scrambled to keep his balance. But the sensation was unmistakable. The ground was moving. The house was shifting. He looked down, his eyes wide with horror. The floorboards had begun to buckle and warp, as if they were alive, writhing, twisting beneath his feet. Dark, oily tendrils seeped up from between the cracks in the wood, creeping toward him with slow, deliberate movements. Evan scrambled back, his heart racing. What was happening? What was this? He could feel the tendrils brush against the skin, icy cold and slick, and he recoiled in terror. It was no longer just a room that was alive. It was the entire house. The floor, the walls, the air. It was all shifting, warping, changing. Evan could feel it, like a deep, primal tremor that resonated through his very bones. The house was alive, and it was reaching for him, pulling him into its grasp. The whispers grew louder, frantic, as if the house itself was losing patience. "Open the door!" Evan's heart thudded in his chest, his thoughts a jumbled mess. He had to get out. He had to leave. But the door would not open. The more he struggled, the more the house seemed to tighten around him. And then he saw something, a figure, standing in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the dim light that filtered through the cracks in the door. It was tall, taller than any person should be. Its silhouette was indistinct, shifting, like a shadow with no form. But Evan could feel its presence. It was watching him, The figure moved, slowly, deliberately. Its footsteps were quiet, almost imperceptible, but Evan could feel them in the pit of his stomach. Each step was like a pulse, each one coming closer, closer, until it was standing just in front of him. Evan opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The air in the room was thick, choking, and he couldn't breathe. He tried to push himself to his feet, to run, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. They were too weak, too heavy, weighed down by the creeping darkness that had consumed the room. The figure bent down, its face now inches from his. But it didn't have a face. It was just a void, a black, endless hole where a face should be. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, it spoke. "Open the door, or it will never end." Evan's chest tightened. He could feel his sanity unraveling, piece by piece, as the room seemed to close in on him, as if the walls were crushing him, suffocating him. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, filling his mind, drowning out everything else. And then, just as the figure began to reach out toward him, the door behind him, the one he had tried so desperately to open, began to creak. Slowly, agonizingly, the door opened. A sliver of light poured into the room. But it wasn't the light of salvation. It was a light that promised nothing but more darkness. "Open the door." Evan's heart raced. The light spilling from the crack in the door was faint, weak, almost as if it were being suffocated by the dark void that had overtaken the room. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes fixed on the narrow opening, the gap widening slowly, agonizingly. It wasn't a light that brought comfort. It was the kind of light that beckoned, that promised more fear, more terror, if only he dared to approach it. The figure in front of him, if it could even be called a figure, shifted, its form writhing and bending like liquid smoke, pulsating with an unnatural energy. Evan's legs shook beneath him, his entire body trembling as the overwhelming presence of the thing before him made the room feel smaller, suffocating. The whispers intensified again, their volume rising in unison with his increasing panic. "Open it. Open the door, or you will never escape." The words wrapped around him like a suffocating blanket. He wanted to scream. He wanted to break free, to run, to do anything but stand there. But his body betrayed him. The terror in his chest had rooted him to the spot, his mind swirling with thoughts of what might lie beyond that door. Would it be salvation, or would it lead him further into the nightmare that had already consumed him? For a split second, everything was still. The whispering, the shifting, the cold, and the blackness. It all seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to act. But Evan, locked in place by an invisible force, felt his own breath stutter and falter. His mind was screaming at him to run, to get out of the room, away from the figure, away from whatever was behind that door. But his body felt frozen in time. The door opened wider. A low, guttural noise reverberated through the room, coming not from the figure, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere in the house itself. It was as though the entire structure was groaning, as if it was alive and protesting against the disturbance. "Open it now, Evan. Open the door. You have no choice." It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a plea. It was a demand, a command that echoed through the air, vibrating in his very soul. Evan's hand, of its own accord, reached out towards a gap in the door. He could feel the cold air seep through the crack, brushing against his skin like icy fingers. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to pull back, to leave the room before it was too late. But something darker, urged him forward. He touched the door. For a moment, everything went silent again. No whispers, no shifting, no movement. Only the soft press of his hand against the cold, wooden surface. And then it happened. A jolt of electricity shot through him, paralyzing his body, sending his spine straight as though he had been struck by lightning. His mind went blank for a split second, and in that moment he could feel a presence, something ancient, something beyond comprehension, seep into his thoughts. It was like a voice inside his head, but it wasn't just one voice. It was thousands of voices, murmuring in unison, growing louder with each passing second. "We are watching you, Evan. We are waiting for you to choose. Open the door, or we will open it for you." The words seemed to echo in his mind, spiraling out of control, and the coldness, the suffocating presence of the house, seemed to intensify. The walls felt as though they were closing in, narrowing, tightening around him like a trap. His chest constricted, making it hard to breathe. He had to get out. He had to, but his body wouldn't obey him. His fingers gripped the door tighter, pulling it open just a fraction more. The room beyond was as dark as before, but now Evan could hear something, a faint sound, low, rhythmic, almost like breathing, coming from the other side. It was steady, slow, and chilling. "Come closer." The voice was no longer inside his head. It was coming from the other side of the door. The breathing was real. It was alive. Something was waiting for him. The figure behind him, no longer a silhouette, but something more grotesque, more defined, moved closer. Its form was becoming clearer, more solid, but it was twisted, deformed, its body stretching and shrinking in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Its face was still a void, but there was something wrong about it now. The emptiness was filled with hunger, an insatiable, terrifying hunger that reached out toward him. The room seemed to spin. The door, now open wider, beckoned him in, drawn to the darkness beyond. Evan, overwhelmed by the pressure, by the commands in his mind, stepped forward, and then he saw it. At the edge of the doorframe, just beyond the threshold, there was a faint flicker of movement, a shape. Something was moving in the darkness. It was small, barely visible at first, but then it grew, expanding, becoming more defined. It was a hand, skeletal and thin, reaching out toward him from the dark. Long fingers, white and bony, stretched forward with a slow, deliberate motion. The skin was taut, like stretched leather, and it seemed to twitch with anticipation, as though it had been waiting for this moment. Evan's heart thudded in his chest. His body was no longer his own. He wasn't thinking, he wasn't acting. He was being pulled into something he didn't understand, something beyond his control. He tried to step back, but his feet wouldn't move. His legs were as heavy as lead, his mind clouded with an overwhelming sense of dread and compulsion. The hand moved closer. It was coming for him. Slowly, but with a terrible certainty. And then the whispers began again, louder than ever. "Open it. Open the door. Let us in." The room, the house, seemed to pulse with the sound, the rhythm of its twisted heartbeat, echoing in Evan's skull, rattling his very bones. He reached out. He didn't want to. He didn't choose this. But his hand, shaking uncontrollably, reached toward the doorframe, towards that hand reaching for him. The instant his fingers brushed against the cold wood of the door, the thing, whatever it was, reacted. The hand recoiled, but not before the air around Evan thickened. A pressure unbearable and suffocating pressed in from all sides. His mind reeled, everything around him warping, distorting, becoming more twisted, more alien. The room, the house, was no longer a house. It was a living, breathing organism, its flesh pulsing with grotesque life. The walls groaned and shuddered, bending as if they were made of something soft, something pliable. The floor beneath his feet seemed to ripple, shifting like water. And the whispers, oh, the whispers, now filled his every thought, every synapse, as though they were consuming his very soul. "Open it. Open the door. Let us in." He couldn't fight it anymore. He couldn't resist the pressure. He couldn't fight the overwhelming urge that had taken over his mind. With a final, desperate motion, he pushed the door all the way open, and then there was nothing. Silence. For a heartbeat, a single breath, everything stopped. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Evan's body was still, frozen, in the doorway, staring into the darkness beyond. But then, a voice broke the silence. It wasn't inside his mind. It wasn't coming from the shadows. It came from behind him. You shouldn't have opened it, Evan. Evan spun around, his breath catching in his throat. The figure, now fully formed, fully real, stood right in front of him. Its face, once a void, now bore a twisted, grotesque grin. A smile stretched impossibly wide across its face, and its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were dark, empty pits, staring directly at him. Now, you belong to us. And before he could scream, before he could move, the darkness swallowed him whole. The first thing Evan felt was the suffocating grip of cold, freezing, unrelenting, like the touch of death itself. His body trembled uncontrollably, but not from the chill. It was the terror, the overwhelming sense of dread that had overwhelmed him the moment he stepped into the darkness beyond the door. His chest tightened, his breath shallow, but the air was thick, suffocating. He couldn't breathe. The silence that surrounded him was deafening, pressing against his eardrums. It was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl, that made you question if there was something hidden just beyond your perception, something waiting to reveal itself. He couldn't see anything. The darkness was absolute, consuming every inch of the room he had stepped into. His eyes struggled, unable to adjust to the unnatural blackness, as though the shadows had become a tangible thing, a force that resisted even the light that should have come with the opening of the door. Evan's legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor. His body felt like lead, weighted down by the invisible force that seemed to be pulling him deeper into the room. His mind, too, was clouded. It was as though the very atmosphere had become thick with something malignant, something foul. "Welcome," the voice from behind him spoke. It was low, guttural, as if it emanated from deep within the house, deep within the very walls themselves. It had no form, no shape. It was just there, always there, lurking, watching. Evan's heart raced, the rhythm almost deafening. His eyes darted around, searching for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing, only the suffocating dark. The air around him seemed to thicken, becoming more oppressive by the second. The very walls of the house seemed to press inward, closing around him. "You've opened the door." The voice again, now slightly mocking. Now there is no turning back. Evan's hands clenched into fists. He had to move, had to do something, anything, but his body wouldn't obey him. His legs were unresponsive, stiff, as if bound by invisible chains. His pulse thudded in his ears, and his thoughts were a whirlwind of terror and confusion. There was something in the dark with him, something he couldn't see but could feel, a presence. It was as though it were waiting, watching. Every inch of the room seemed alive, every corner pregnant with an energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He felt as if the darkness itself had formed a sentient will, and that will was now turning its attention toward him. He heard it then, a soft scraping sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere behind him. It was the sound of something sliding across the floor, slow and deliberate. It moved closer, closer still, each scrape dragging along the floor like fingernails over a chalkboard. The sound grew louder with every passing second, each scrape more agonizing than the last. Evan's breathing became ragged, his hands pressed against the cold floor, his fingers digging into the wooden planks in an attempt to steady himself. But it was hopeless. The darkness was alive, and it was closing in around him. The scraping sound came again, closer now, much closer. His mind raced. What was it? What was making that sound? And then he felt it. Something cold and clammy brushed against the back of his neck. It was a touch that made his skin crawl. He whipped around, his eyes wide in terror, searching for the source. But there was nothing, nothing but darkness. His breath caught in his throat. The scraping continued, now relentless, drawing nearer by the second. The presence in the room seemed to grow stronger, more insistent, its invisible fingers reaching out to him, tightening their grip. The shadows around him seemed to move, shifting like living creatures, slithering across the walls and floor. "You open the door, Evan," the voice whispered again, this time closer, almost in his ear. "And now you're ours." It was then that Evan felt the cold hand, icy and firm, wrap around his wrist. It was a grip so strong, it felt as though it could snap bone. He gasped, his breath catching in his throat, the sound of his own heartbeat drowning everything else out. He tried to pull away, but the hand held fast, dragging him across the floor with a terrifying strength. He struggled, kicking, thrashing, trying to break free, but it was no use. The hand didn't relent. It pulled him deeper into the darkness, farther into the unknown. The more he resisted, the tighter the grip became. The scraping sound was now all around him. Not just one sound, but many, thousands, like the scratching of claws against wood, the clicking of nails on stone. It was a sound that scraped at his sanity, that made his vision blur and his thoughts unravel. He twisted, trying to escape, but he couldn't break free. The darkness was swallowing him whole, consuming him piece by piece. It was inescapable. The house, the darkness, the presence. Everything was closing in on him. Suddenly, the grip on his wrist loosened. For a moment, he felt a glimmer of hope, a brief sense of relief. But it was fleeting. The presence wasn't gone. It was still there, just beyond the edge of his vision, just out of reach. But it had shifted. Now, it was all around him. The air turned colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that Evan's breath crystallized in the air. His teeth chattered uncontrollably, and his limbs felt numb, as if the very essence of life was being drained from him. The floor beneath him shuddered again, and this time, the vibrations were more intense. It wasn't just the house groaning. It felt like the earth itself was shaking, trembling under the weight of something ancient, something powerful that had been awakened by the opening of the door. Then the room shifted again. The darkness stretched warped, as though the very fabric of reality had been torn. The walls seemed to ripple, bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. The space around him felt like it was expanding and contracting at once, warping in ways that made Evan dizzy. And that's when he saw it. A light. It wasn't the weak, distant light that had beckoned him into the room. It was something different, something pure and bright, shining from the farthest corner of the room. It was almost blinding in its intensity, but it was beautiful, drawing him toward it, like a moth to a flame. His body, already exhausted, didn't fight it. He crawled toward the light, his hands scraping against the cold floor as he dragged himself forward. Each movement felt like an eternity, each inch closer to the light feeling like a victory. But as he drew nearer, the light began to change. It shifted, flickering, and suddenly, the room felt colder, colder than it had ever been before. The light was no longer pure. It was wrong. It twisted and contorted, becoming jagged, distorted, like something from a nightmare. Evan's heart skipped a beat. He had made a terrible mistake. The presence that had been following him, stalking him, began to grow stronger, more real. It was no longer just the whispers or the unseen hand. The shadows shifted and solidified, becoming grotesque shapes that lurked in the corners of his vision. And then the figure appeared. It wasn't just a silhouette anymore. It was fully formed, and it stood directly in front of him, blocking the light. Its face was a twisted mask, its features obscured by a veil of shadows that wriggled and writhed like living creatures. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were deep pits, black and endless, staring down at him with a malevolent intent. "You shouldn't have opened the door, Evan," it whispered, its voice low and haunting, vibrating through his bones. Evan's body screamed for him to run, to flee, but the shadows wrapped around him, pulling him back into the darkness, locking him in place. The light was gone now, replaced by an all-consuming blackness. And he realized then, with a sickening clarity, that he had never truly opened the door. The door had opened him. The house was no longer just a house. It had become a part of him, just as he had become a part of it. The door had never been the escape. It had been the trap. And now, there was no way out. The moment Evan's eyes met the dark figure in front of him, a surge of pure, unadulterated terror flooded his body. The thing, this monstrosity, stood perfectly still, as though studying him, measuring his fear. The whispers had stopped for a moment, as if they were waiting, too. The house was quiet now, but it was a heavy, oppressive kind of quiet. It was as if the entire structure had paused in anticipation, holding its breath. Evan's chest tightened with panic. His mind screamed for him to turn and run, to flee from the suffocating shadows that now surrounded him. But his feet felt rooted to the ground, his limbs as stiff as iron. The darkness pressed in closer, thick and suffocating, wrapping around his body like chains, pulling him deeper into the grip of the house. He wanted to scream, but the air in his lungs had turned cold, stagnant. He couldn't breathe. Not properly. The weight of the atmosphere was unbearable, and every sound, every creak of the house, every rustle in the shadows, seemed amplified in his ears, rattling his already fragile sense of reality. The figure before him was still, its form growing clearer as the seconds ticked by. The shadows that clung to it like a shroud rippled and twisted, revealing glimpses of things too terrible to describe. Long, gnarled limbs, fingers bent at unnatural angles, and a face. Oh God, that face. It wasn't a face at all. It was a void, a swirling blackness that shifted and churned as if something was trying to claw its way out from within. There were no eyes, no mouth, only a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to consume the light around it. Evan could feel the oppressive weight of its gaze, even though it had no eyes to see with. The emptiness of its stare seemed to pierce right through him, into the very core of his being. His stomach churned, nausea sweeping over him. His mind was unraveling, trying to comprehend the impossible, trying to make sense of a presence that shouldn't exist. A voice, no, not a voice, but a sound, came from the figure. It was low, almost a growl, but the words were clear. You open the door, Evan. You cannot leave. Not now. Not ever. The words reverberated inside his skull, bouncing off the walls of his mind like a drumbeat. They lingered, clinging to him, gnawing at him, reminding him of the mistake he had made. The door. He had opened it. He thought it was his escape, his chance to break free from the madness of the house. But now, the door had become a prison, and he had just stepped into it willingly. A chill ran down his spine as he felt a shift in the air around him. The darkness deepened, thickening, becoming even more oppressive, suffocating. Evan's lungs burned, desperate for oxygen, but all he could draw in was the cold, stifling air that clung to him like a second skin. His heart hammered against his ribcage, every beat a reminder that he was still alive, still trapped in this nightmare. The figure tilted its head, the motion jerky and unnatural, as if its body didn't quite move the way it should. The shadows surrounding it seemed to move with it, crawling along the floor, the walls, the ceiling. The house itself was alive with the writhing darkness, and Evan could feel it, feel the weight of it pressing in on him from all sides. The very air seemed to shift with an ancient energy, as though the house had been waiting for this moment. You open the door, the figure repeated, its voice deeper now, almost hypnotic. And now you belong to us. Forever. Evan's mind reeled. Belong? Forever? The words didn't make sense. How could he belong here? He wasn't one of them. He wasn't part of this thing. He was just a man, an ordinary man. But the more the figure spoke, the more he felt himself slipping away, losing grip on who he was. It was like the darkness itself was erasing him, rewriting his very identity, his very existence. He forced himself to move, his legs trembling beneath him, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure. His feet dragged, and he stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He wanted to scream, wanted to beg for mercy, but his voice betrayed him. No sound came from his mouth, just the gnawing silence of the house. the ever-present presence of the figure before him. Suddenly, the floor beneath him gave a violent shudder. Evan staggered, his body shaking as the very foundations of the house groaned in protest. It was like the house was alive, like it was breathing, moving. He could hear the walls creaking, bending, as if they were closing in around him. The temperature dropped even further, and Evan could see his breath in the air, thick, misty clouds forming in the chill. And then the whispers returned. They started softly, but within seconds they grew louder, louder, until they filled his ears, his mind, until they were the only thing he could hear. Thousands of voices, all speaking at once, all demanding the same thing. Open the door. Open the door. Let us in. Evan clutched his head, trying to block out the noise. It felt as though his brain was being torn apart, shredded by the relentless barrage of voices. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to focus, trying to hold on to what was left of his sanity. "No!" he cried, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. But the whispers didn't stop. They only grew louder, more insistent. "Open the door. Open it now. You have no choice." His eyes flew open, and he saw the figure moving closer. It was gliding toward him, its movements unerringly fluid, as if it were made of smoke and shadow. The walls of the house seemed to pulse with the figure's every step, reacting to its presence, folding inward. The house was closing in on him. There was no escape. "You have opened the door," the figure said, its voice now both calm and ominous, like a final judgment. "And now, you will stay, forever." Evan's legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor, his hands scrabbling for something, anything, solid to hold on to. But there was nothing, only the cold, the darkness, the whispers, and the ever-looming figure that now towered over him. His vision blurred. His thoughts became disjointed, fragments of memories and fears blending into one tangled mess. He remembered his life, his home, his family, the world he had known. But it was all slipping away. The house, the figure, the shadows, they were consuming him, erasing him. He could feel himself being pulled apart from the inside out, his identity unraveling. And then in the silence that followed, he understood. The door wasn't just a doorway. It was a threshold, a line between worlds. And now that he had crossed it, there was no turning back. The figure stood over him, its form towering, monstrous. Its face was still a swirling void, but Evan could feel it, could feel its gaze, its hunger, drawing closer. The whispers became louder again, rising to a deafening crescendo. "You opened the door. And now, you are ours." Evan felt the darkness swallow him whole. It wasn't like falling asleep. It wasn't like anything he could have prepared for. It was a collapse, a complete erasure of everything he had been. He was no longer Evan. He was nothing. And in that silence, in that eternal dark, the house, the thing, waited. It had opened the door. And now, it was time to take what it had been waiting for. Forever. The silence was suffocating. For what felt like an eternity, Evan existed in a space where time no longer held any meaning. His thoughts were a hazy fog, drifting in and out of awareness. He wasn't sure if he was still alive or if he had passed beyond the threshold into something far worse. His body felt cold, numb, and detached from itself, as if he had become a mere shadow of who he once was. The darkness that had consumed him didn't just surround him, it became him. In this void, he could sense things shifting around him, something alive, the house, or whatever it had become, pulsed with a low, rhythmic thrum, like a beating heart beneath the foundation of the world. The air hummed with a resonance that rattled his bones. He wasn't alone here. Whatever had waited behind the door, whatever had called to him, was still here. Evan tried to move, but his limbs wouldn't obey. It was as though he was caught in a state between life and death, trapped in a place where the very laws of existence no longer applied. His body was frozen, yet his mind raced. The whispers were still there, buzzing in the background, always present, growing louder, more insistent. They were like 1,000 voices, distorted and unrecognizable, speaking all at once, tearing at his sanity. "You are ours, Evan." The voice echoed again. It wasn't just a voice. It was an entity, a force that existed in every shadow, in every corner of this accursed place. It was both inside him and all around him. "You opened the door, and now we are free." Free? Evan's mind reeled. The door had never been an escape, not for him. He had thought that crossing the threshold would bring him to something better, to freedom. But now he knew. He had opened the door for them. He had unleashed whatever darkness had been hiding behind it. And now that darkness was taking hold, spreading like a disease, consuming everything in its path. The house, no, the place, shifted again, its walls groaning and creaking as if the very structure was alive, stretching and twisting, as if it were trying to devour him whole. The floor beneath him seemed to ripple, like a pool of water disturbed by an unseen force. He could feel the pull again, a tightening around his chest, as though the very air had turned to syrup, holding him captive. And then, suddenly, the whisper stopped. Evan's heart thudded painfully in his chest as an eerie silence filled the space. His eyes, if he still had eyes, tried to pierce through the darkness, but it was no use. His mind screamed for him to escape, to run, to fight back, but there was nothing to fight. A cold hand, icy, unnatural, gripped his wrist. He gasped. The touch was so sudden, so unexpected, that it sent a jolt of panic through his body. It wasn't human, and it wasn't alive, not in the way he understood. It was like being touched by something that wasn't quite real, something between the physical and the spectral. His heart skipped a beat as he felt the grip tighten, pulling him into the blackness that surrounded him. The hand was pulling him somewhere deeper. "Come." The voice was there again, that low, guttural whisper, now filled with impatience. "You've been chosen." The hand dragged him forward, and Evan fought against it with every ounce of strength he had left. But it was futile. The grip was relentless, its cold fingers seeping into his very soul, freezing him from the inside out. He could feel his sense of self, his very essence, slipping away with each pull, each movement through the crushing darkness. The weight of the void pressed down on him, suffocating him, robbing him of every shred of resistance. His thoughts were a blur. He could feel his body growing heavier, weaker. His breath came in short gasps, each exhalation like a cloud of ice in the freezing air. The shadows seemed to close in on him from all sides, tightening their grip like a noose. And then he understood the house wasn't just alive. It was hungry. "We were waiting." The voice again, this time louder, closer. "We've been waiting for you, Evan. For so long." The darkness swirled around him, and he felt it closing in like a vast, hungry maw. The house, or whatever it was, wanted him. It wanted his soul, his very being. It had waited for him to open the door, to step into its trap. But now, as the shadows twisted and danced around him, Evan could feel something shift, something deep inside him. A small spark of defiance flickered within his chest. And for the first time since stepping through the door, he felt the urge to fight. He couldn't just give in. He couldn't let it take him. Not without a fight. Not without understanding what had been unleashed. "No!" he screamed, though his voice felt distant, muffled by the oppressive weight of the darkness. But the shadows only laughed. "You cannot escape, Evan. You never could. The door has already been opened." The hand that had been dragging him forward loosened, and for a split second, Evan was left alone in the suffocating silence. His body was still paralyzed, but his mind was wide awake. He was trapped, yes, but there was something else, something powerful, something familiar. In the silence, he heard it again, the whisper, faint but clear. "You opened the door, but you were meant to. You were the key." The realization hit him like a lightning strike. The door hadn't just opened a passage into this nightmare. It had opened something within him, The house, the darkness, the figure, it wasn't just about trapping him. It had been about bringing him here, about unlocking the darkness that had been waiting inside of him all along. He was the key, the one who had unlocked this place, who had unwittingly allowed the thing to escape. And in that moment, Evan knew the truth. He wasn't just a victim. He had been chosen. He had been created for this. A pulse of energy rippled through the air, the darkness around him crackling with a malevolent power. The shadows began to form shapes, figures, twisted and deformed, but alive in their own way. They crawled along the walls, the floor, the ceiling, their forms shifting and contorting in unnatural ways. They were part of him now, as much a part of this place as the house itself. The hand that had gripped him now retreated, its cold touch replaced by something else, something warm, familiar, yet terrifying. Evan turned his head, and before him stood a figure. Not the monstrous one, but something else, a shadow of his own form, his own face. "You opened the door," the figure said, its voice a haunting echo of his own. "And now, you belong to us." Evan tried to speak, but no words came. The figure stepped closer, its form shifting, swirling in and out of focus. It was him, but it wasn't. It was what he had become. The realization was crushing. The door had not just opened a path. It had created a new reality. A reality where Evan was no longer a man. He was part of this place, part of the house, part of whatever nightmare had been unleashed. "Now," the figure whispered, "we are one, forever." And as the shadows closed in around him, Evan understood. The door had never been meant to let him out. It had only ever been meant to let him in. Forever. The end.